Okay, I made a video about the Flycreek from Big Agnes already, but I'm making a second video because I wasn't really happy with the first video. After using the tent, I kind of realized something, and that's that all little tiny tents kind of do the same thing. So rather than talk a lot about specifically the Flycreek, I'm just going to talk about little tiny tents. I've got my custom little tiny tent that I already bought from Bear Paw Wilderness. I had this custom made, and it cost about 700 bucks. And I bought this one on sale, the Flycreek, for only about $350. So it was half the price. But, you know, and I really wanted it because it's got lights and it looks really cool. It's very stealthy and it weighs about the same. But the issue is that everything is sort of the same, you know. So little tiny tents, they kind of do one thing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is. Basically, when you get inside of a little tiny tent, okay, it's better than a bivvy, because a bivvy is touching you. So when you get inside the bivvy bag, there's condensation takes place. Your body heat causes the temperature inside the shelter to go up much more than on a larger dome-shaped tent. You know, a two-person tent, the temperature goes up in a more mild manner, so that humidity and condensation aren't such a huge issue. The first hour or two that you get inside of your little tiny tent, like the Flycreek, the temperature inside the shelter is going to go up about 3 to 5 degrees warmer inside the shelter than outside. That's going to cause a cloud of humidity to form inside of the shelter. And as you can see, that cloud of humidity really has no place to go. The copper spur has got some vents on top of the shelter, which are good. That allows that warm air to come out. And on my shelter, I've got these U-doors on the sides that, you know, offer a lot of ventilation so that the warm air can escape. But the issue is that, you know, and also on the Flycreek, you can leave your door open. So basically, there's two little tiny tents that are basically a mesh bivvy with a rain fly tarp that goes around it. That's the Flycreek, and there's the Ghost from Mountain Hardware. And then there's two more framed out tents that have got a huge rain fly on them that are kind of shaped like a parachute that have to be staked out. That's the Eastern Mountain Sports Velocity and the MSR Hubba. Okay, and you know, the issue is that the DAC pole frame that you get, it's kind of ineffective. The DAC poles that frame out the tent, they get people interested in these little tiny tents, but the DAC poles themselves have much less of an effect on the overall sensation that you get from the tent than the rainfly itself. So the rainfly is huge, and that doesn't give a lot of opportunity for the humidity, the condensation that develops inside of the shelter to get out. Because since the shelter is really small, the condensation is more. It needs more opportunity for that warm air to escape. Because for the first 2 hours, the tiny tents get really, really warm, a little bit too warm to be in your sleeping bag, and it's damp air, it's moist air. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, the shelter's kind of wet, and the temperature drops drastically, and it can get really cold. So, you know, like with the Velocity from EMS and the Hubba's got vents on top of the shelter, but both of those shelters are little tiny. You save about 1.5 pounds by getting into a little tiny space where you don't have a lot of room to move around in. But the rain tarps are huge. They have to be pulled out. The only way to get that humidity out of there is to open up the vestibule, you know, to leave it wide open. Same thing with the Ghost and the Flycreek. The door has to be kind of left open to give that humidity a place to escape. You know, otherwise you're going to be really hot and then really cold. So, okay, so overall, you know, these little tiny framed out tents, essentially they're not really framed out tents. They have to be staked out. The idea of a framed out two-person tent that's shaped like a dome is that it doesn't have to be placed on soft ground that can be staked out in. You know, you can put it on the deck, or you can put it on cement, or you could put it on rocks, etc. You can put it in a place where you can't stake it out. And a little tiny tent fits into a smaller space, but there really aren't any little tiny tents out there that have plenty of ventilation on the roof that don't need to be staked out. Pulling the sides out on the side of the tent, it contributes much more to the functionality of the tent than the DAC poles themselves. The DAC poles are light and they're awesome, but there isn't a lot of functionality to the tent added to the shelter by the DAC poles in comparison to other lightweight tiny tents that don't have the framed out construction. Okay, like this tent over here, it does pretty much the same thing without the frame. It has to be staked out. That's pretty much the huge issue. If I can just get one side staked out and the other side falls down, that's pretty much the same as the Flycreek or the Ghost. You know, there's kind of like no back end. It's kind of like a bivvy at one end and a huge domed out tent at the other end. You know, if you look inside here, it's kind of small. Let's see if it's a pretty small space down by the foot. Okay, and this is completely pulled out. Most of the time, or a lot of the time, you're not going to have this many opportunities to get this thing pulled out. I mean, a lot of the time it's going to be kind of partially collapsed on you. So more or less, I would say that all little tiny tents, they more or less do the same thing. You know, they're all DAC poles. They're holding up that front end. You've got that 35-inch wide front end there that's kind of big, sort of unnecessary. A little tiny door that needs to be left open to allow the humidity out. And then eventually it needs to be closed up. You know, right before you fall asleep, I guess you have to close that up before you go to bed for the night. The material is super, super thin, so the temperature of the night air, it does eventually make its way into the shelter, because that's really just blocking the wind and the rain. Wind chill factor can be an issue. When the wind is blowing against the side of these tiny tents, they cool off the fabric, and then the air that's inside the shelter, just on the other side of the shelter, gets cold. And because the shelter is really small and doesn't have a lot of air inside of it, the air kind of gets cooled off and the tents get really cold inside. Not to mention that if they're wet from the humidity, you get in them, it creates a lot of condensation. They get kind of wet. That drops the temperature down even further, so that at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, it can get really cold. Okay, now granted that double wall tents are warmer than single wall tents. That mesh bivvy on the inside, it keeps the sleeping camper a little bit warmer than if it wasn't there. The condensation that gathers on the nylon, it turns into pretty big droplets that go onto the mesh tent. So that in the morning when you break this thing down, you've got a wet rain fly plus a wet mesh tent. So, you know, overall, I already have this tent. It does more or less the same thing. Cuban fiber, the water droplets on the Cuban fiber are at least a little bit smaller than on the nylon. But I don't think that there's a huge advantage to buying myself a Flycreek or a Ghost from Mountain Hardware over the Cuban fiber. Okay, so some other basic issues that I had with gear that I picked up was I got a peanut lighter that completely fell apart when I got out to my campsite. It had like 3 or 4 parts to it, and every single part of the peanut lighter fell apart. I got the brass Esbit alcohol stove, and I filled it with alcohol and closed it up and put it in my pack and went hiking. And when I got to my campsite, for some reason it had barely any alcohol in it at all. It only had like 10 minutes of alcohol in it, which I think is an argument for the solid fuel cubes of fuel from Esbit. You know, with the solid fuel cubes, you know exactly how much fire you have with you. Each one is 15 minutes of cooking. With the alcohol, it could last 25, 35, 45 minutes, or you might not have any and it might only last 10 minutes. It's very unpredictable to know just exactly how long your alcohol is going to last when you're cooking with a alcohol fuel stove. And let's see. Oh, I got the Prada Stretch Zion convertible pants, and I thought that they were really heavy. You know, and so those are some other issues that I had with some gear that I picked up. And oh, I also got the TI3 flashlight, and I guess it doesn't use an LED, and it ran out of batteries after like 30 minutes.